Picture this. It's a freezing night somewhere in Ice Age Europe, and there's no insulated wall standing between you and a brutal sub-zero wind. No roof, no furnace humming quietly in some closet you've never bothered to open. Just open landscape, dropping temperatures, and a group of humans who, by every modern instinct we have, should absolutely not be surviving this night comfortably. And yet, somehow, they did repeatedly for hundreds of thousands of years, across nearly every climate on the planet, from freezing tundras to scorching deserts to humid rainforests. No architects, no power tools, no insulation rated by some helpful number on a hardware store label. Just raw, accumulated knowledge passed down, generation after generation, turning the literal opposite of a house into something that worked just as well, sometimes arguably better, for the specific lives they were living. So let's actually dig into how this worked, because the real answer isn't ancient humans just toughed it out. It's a remarkably sophisticated system of solutions that modern humans, frankly, would struggle to replicate without a hardware store and several online tutorials. Let's start with the most obvious, most underrated shelter option available to early humans: the planet itself. Caves and natural rock overhangs were, for an enormous stretch of human history, the original housing market, and honestly, they came with some genuinely excellent built-in features. Caves maintain a remarkably stable internal temperature year-round, staying noticeably cooler than the outside air during summer and noticeably warmer during winter, simply because the surrounding rock acts as a massive thermal buffer, soaking up and slowly releasing heat rather than letting temperatures swing wildly the way the open air does. This wasn't some lucky coincidence ancient humans stumbled into either. It's basic thermal physics, the same principle that makes wine cellars and underground bunkers naturally temperature stable today, except ancient humans got this benefit completely free, with zero installation cost and zero monthly utility bill. Caves also offered something just as valuable as temperature control, protection from wind and precipitation, two factors that, frankly, do more to make you miserable and hypothermic than cold temperature alone ever could. A person can survive surprisingly cold air temperatures as long as they're dry and shielded from wind chill, but combine cold with wet, windy exposure, and your survival window shrinks dramatically. Caves and rock overhangs solved this problem elegantly, providing a dry, wind-blocked space using nothing but pre-existing geology. No construction required, no permits, no contractor ghosting you halfway through the job. But here's the catch, and it's a pretty significant one. Good, livable caves aren't exactly evenly distributed across the entire planet. You can't simply decide to live somewhere and expect a conveniently sized, dry, defensible cave to be waiting for you nearby. This limitation pushed ancient humans toward developing something arguably even more impressive than finding the right cave: the ability to build effective shelters from scratch, using nothing but the materials available in whatever specific environment they happened to find themselves in. This is where things get genuinely fascinating, because portable, constructed shelters represent one of the most underappreciated engineering achievements in all of human history. Take the structures built by various Ice Age hunter-gatherer groups using mammoth bones and tusks as a structural framework, then covered with hides for insulation and weatherproofing. Archaeological sites have uncovered the remains of these structures, sometimes built using dozens of mammoth bones carefully arranged into a dome-like framework, essentially repurposing the skeleton of one of the largest land animals that ever existed into a functioning building material. This wasn't some desperate makeshift improvisation either. The construction shows clear intentionality, specific bones selected and positioned for their structural properties, suggesting a level of engineering knowledge passed down and refined across generations, essentially an entire body of architectural expertise that simply never got written down because writing hadn't been invented yet. Animal hide tents represent another genuinely brilliant solution, and if this sounds primitive, consider that modern high-performance camping tents are still, at their core, doing the exact same basic job: a flexible, lightweight, weatherproof membrane stretched over a supportive frame. Hide tents offered something that rigid stone or wood structures couldn't: portability. For groups that needed to follow migrating herds, track seasonal food availability, or simply relocate based on changing conditions, a shelter you could pack up, carry, and reassemble somewhere else within hours was an enormous practical advantage over anything more permanent. The structure didn't need to be fancy, it needed to do three specific jobs extremely well: block wind, repel precipitation, and trap a layer of warm air close to the body. An animal hide, properly treated and assembled, accomplishes all three remarkably effectively. Speaking of trapping warm air, let's talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough credit in this entire conversation: the genius of small, enclosed spaces. Modern houses are enormous compared to most ancient dwellings, and that size difference matters more than people realize. A smaller, more enclosed shelter requires dramatically less energy to heat because you're warming a much smaller volume of air, and that warm air has less surface area through which to escape. Ancient shelters were often deliberately compact, sometimes uncomfortably so by modern standards, specifically because a tight, low-ceilinged structure with a small entrance retains body heat and fire heat far more efficiently than a large, airy space ever could. Your modern living room, with its soaring ceiling and big open floor plan, looks impressive on a real estate listing, but from a pure thermal efficiency standpoint, it's actually a nightmare compared to the tight, practical dwellings ancient humans were building. Now let's bring fire into this conversation, because honestly, fire might be the single most important missing piece that made shelter without houses actually viable. A shelter doesn't need thick insulated walls if there's a reliable heat source sitting right in the middle of it, actively generating warmth throughout the night. Fire transformed a simple windbreak or a basic hide structure into something genuinely livable, even in brutally cold conditions, and ancient humans got remarkably skilled at managing fire specifically for shelter purposes. Banking coals to maintain heat through the night without needing constant tending, positioning fires to maximize heat reflection off nearby rock surfaces or hide walls, and arranging sleeping areas specifically around expected heat distribution patterns. In a lot of ways, fire functioned as the missing insulation, the missing furnace, and the missing nightlight all rolled into one single, endlessly reusable technology. Let's talk about something that genuinely surprises people when they first learn about it: body heat as a deliberate, calculated shelter strategy. Sleeping in close physical proximity to other group members wasn't just a comfort preference or some kind of accidental side effect of limited space, it was an actively used thermal strategy. A group of people sleeping closely together inside a confined shelter generates a meaningful, measurable amount of collective body heat, and ancient humans absolutely understood and relied on this. Smaller shelters housing multiple people weren't cramped because ancient humans didn't know any better. They were compact because that compactness, combined with shared body heat, created a genuinely effective warming system using zero fuel and zero ongoing maintenance. This also explains a lot about typical group sizes within shared shelters throughout history. There was likely a real, practical sweet spot between enough people to generate useful warmth and too many people for the available space to handle efficiently. Clothing deserves its own dedicated section here too, because clothing is essentially shelter that you wear directly on your body, and ancient humans developed remarkably sophisticated clothing technology specifically to extend the function of whatever larger shelter they happened to have access to. Layered clothing using different materials for different purposes, an inner layer for moisture management, an outer layer for wind and water resistance, was being developed and refined by ancient populations living in cold climates long before anyone had a word for moisture-wicking base layer. Some archaeological evidence even suggests certain ancient populations developed tailored, fitted clothing specifically designed to trap air more effectively than simple draped hides ever could, essentially inventing the conceptual ancestor of the modern winter coat using nothing but hide, sinew, and bone needles. If your shelter for the night was going to be a relatively thin hide tent or even just a natural windbreak, having genuinely excellent clothing wasn't optional. It was the actual primary defense against the cold, with the structure itself functioning more as a supporting backup system. Let's get into something that often gets overlooked in this whole conversation: site selection, because choosing exactly where to set up shelter mattered just as much as how that shelter was actually constructed. Ancient humans consistently favored locations that offered natural windbreaks, hillsides, rock formations, or dense vegetation positioned specifically to block prevailing wind direction, dramatically reducing how hard any constructed shelter actually had to work to keep occupants warm and protected. Proximity to water mattered enormously too, but not too close. Close enough for easy access, far enough to avoid flooding risk, and to keep some distance from the predators and insects that tend to congregate near water sources at night. Elevation mattered as well. Slightly raised ground drains better during rain, and tends to avoid the coldest, densest air that settles into low-lying areas overnight. Something anyone who's ever camped in a valley and woken up freezing despite a forecast that promised mild temperatures can probably appreciate on a gut level. Ancient humans weren't randomly throwing down a shelter wherever they happened to stop walking. Site selection was an entire skill set in its own right, built on generations of accumulated environmental observation. Now here's a question worth sitting with for a second. Were ancient humans, lacking permanent houses, actually less comfortable or less protected than we tend to assume from our modern, house-dependent perspective? The honest answer is genuinely more nuanced than you'd expect. In many specific practical ways, mobile shelter systems were better suited to the actual lives ancient humans were living than a permanent house would have been. If your survival depended on following migrating herds, tracking seasonal plant availability, or relocating away from depleted local resources, a fixed, permanent structure would have actually been a liability, tying you to one specific location regardless of whether that location still made practical sense for your group's survival. The flexibility of portable, rebuildable shelter wasn't a consolation prize for not having real houses. It was often a genuinely superior solution for the specific lifestyle ancient humans were actually living. This naturally raises the next big question. If mobile shelter worked so well, why did humans eventually shift toward permanent housing at all? The honest answer connects directly to one of the biggest transitions in all of human history, the development of agriculture. Once groups started cultivating crops in fixed locations, the entire mobility advantage that made portable shelter so valuable suddenly mattered much less, while the advantages of investing serious time and material into a sturdy, permanent structure, protecting stored grain, protecting domesticated animals, providing stable shelter near consistently productive farmland, became significantly more valuable than they would have been for a constantly moving hunter-gatherer group. Permanent housing didn't emerge because humans finally figured out shelter. They'd figured out genuinely effective shelter solutions for hundreds of thousands of years already. Permanent housing emerged because the underlying lifestyle that made permanent investment worthwhile finally arrived. Let's talk about something a little less obvious, but genuinely important: social structure and shared labor. Because building and maintaining shelter without houses wasn't typically a solo endeavor, it relied heavily on coordinated group effort and divided expertise. Certain group members likely specialized in specific shelter-related skills: hide preparation, structural assembly, site evaluation, fire management. The same way modern construction projects rely on different specialized trades working together rather than one single person trying to handle every single aspect alone. This division of labor meant shelter construction and maintenance, despite lacking modern tools, could still be accomplished with genuine efficiency, especially within groups that had developed and refined these specific skills across multiple generations. A shelter that might take one inexperienced person days to assemble poorly could likely be built by an experienced, coordinated group in a small fraction of that time, built correctly the first time using techniques refined through countless prior attempts. There's also a genuinely fascinating climate adaptation angle worth exploring here, because the specific shelter solutions ancient humans developed varied dramatically depending on the environment they were living in, which tells us something important about just how flexible and locally responsive this entire body of knowledge actually was. Populations living in arid desert environments developed shelter strategies focused heavily on shade and airflow, prioritizing protection from intense solar heat during the day while still allowing enough ventilation to prevent stifling, trapped heat at night. Populations in humid tropical environments developed raised structures specifically designed to improve airflow, reduce ground moisture exposure, and limit access for ground-dwelling pests and predators. Populations in extreme cold environments leaned heavily into the compact, fire-centered, hide-insulated strategies we've already discussed in detail. This wasn't one single universal shelter solution applied everywhere with minor tweaks. It was an enormous, independently developed body of region-specific architectural knowledge refined separately by completely unrelated populations who'd never met each other, all converging on remarkably effective, locally optimized answers to the exact same basic problem. It's also worth bringing up something that modern humans rarely have to think about anymore, but mattered enormously in this context: shelter as active protection against predators and other threats, not just weather. A well-positioned shelter, particularly one using natural barriers, restricted entry points, or strategic elevation, served a dual purpose: weather protection and basic defensibility. Some ancient shelter designs specifically incorporated narrow, easily monitored entrances, intentionally limiting how an approaching predator or rival group could enter the space, functioning almost like an early, intuitive form of basic home security built directly into the structural design itself, centuries before anyone thought to install a deadbolt. Let's also touch on something genuinely impressive that doesn't get nearly enough recognition: the sheer durability and reusability built into many of these shelter systems. A well-constructed hide tent or bone framework structure wasn't necessarily a one-time use, disposable solution. Many shelter components were specifically designed to be disassembled, transported, and reassembled multiple times across a group's seasonal migration pattern, meaning the same physical materials might serve as effective shelter across multiple different locations throughout a single year. This represents a genuinely sophisticated approach to resource management, getting maximum practical value out of materials that, in many environments, weren't necessarily easy or quick to acquire in the first place. Building something once and reusing it intelligently across multiple contexts isn't some uniquely modern, sustainability-conscious innovation. Ancient humans were quietly doing exactly that, out of pure practical necessity for an enormous stretch of human history. There's also a genuinely interesting psychological angle worth bringing into this conversation, something that connects shelter to a sense of security that went well beyond pure physical protection from weather. Anthropologists studying traditional and historical shelter practices have pointed out that shelter spaces, even temporary, easily disassembled ones, often carried significant social and symbolic weight within a group, functioning as a defined boundary between inside and outside, between the protected social unit and the unpredictable wider world. This boundary mattered psychologically just as much as it mattered thermally, giving group members a reliable, predictable space to return to regardless of how harsh or unpredictable conditions outside that boundary happened to be. Even a relatively simple structure, once established as the group's defined shelter space, likely provided a meaningful sense of psychological stability and belonging that's easy to overlook when we focus purely on the practical engineering side of this entire topic. It's also worth bringing up the genuinely clever ways ancient humans dealt with ventilation and smoke management inside enclosed shelters, a problem that sounds minor until you realize how quickly an enclosed space heated by an open fire can fill with dangerous, lung-damaging smoke if airflow isn't carefully managed. Many shelter designs incorporated deliberate smoke holes or adjustable openings specifically positioned to let smoke escape while still retaining the bulk of generated heat, a balancing act that required real, accumulated knowledge of airflow patterns, fire behavior, and structural design working together. Get this balance wrong and you end up with either a freezing shelter with decent air quality or a warm shelter slowly poisoning its occupants. And ancient builders clearly understood this trade-off well enough to consistently land somewhere in between, refining specific designs across generations until they reliably solved both problems simultaneously. There's also something worth mentioning about seasonal shelter rotation, a strategy that gets surprisingly little attention given how practical and widespread it appears to have been across numerous ancient populations. Rather than relying on one single shelter type or location year-round, many groups developed entirely different shelter strategies for different seasons. More open ventilated structures during warmer months, tightly sealed, fire-centered structures during colder months, sometimes even relocating to entirely different geographic locations specifically chosen for their seasonal advantages. A sheltered valley during harsh winter winds, a breezy elevated site during humid summer months. This kind of seasonal rotation represents a genuinely sophisticated long-term planning strategy, one that required groups to think well beyond their immediate current shelter needs and plan proactively for conditions that hadn't arrived yet, based entirely on accumulated experience and pattern recognition passed down across generations. Finally, it's worth touching on how some of these ancient shelter principles have quietly survived, almost unchanged, into specific corners of the modern world, which says something fairly remarkable about just how genuinely effective these original solutions actually were. Traditional yurts used by certain nomadic cultures today still rely on the exact same core principles ancient hide tents were built around. A portable, collapsible frame combined with insulating coverings, optimized specifically for a mobile lifestyle. Modern expedition tents, despite using synthetic materials and engineered poles instead of bone and hide, are still fundamentally solving the exact same problem in the exact same basic way. A lightweight, packable structure that blocks wind and precipitation while trapping a livable pocket of warm air inside. We didn't actually invent better shelter concepts so much as we found better materials to build the same fundamentally sound ideas ancient humans had already worked out through nothing but patient trial and error. So how did ancient humans actually live without houses? The honest, complete answer is that they didn't really live without shelter at all. They lived without one extremely specific, modern version of shelter, the large, permanent, fixed structure most of us picture immediately when we hear the word house. What they actually had instead was an enormous, sophisticated, deeply practical toolkit of alternative solutions. Natural geological shelter where available, expertly engineered portable structures where it wasn't, fire management refined into genuine expertise, clothing technology functioning as wearable shelter, strategic site selection based on generations of accumulated environmental knowledge, and coordinated group effort that turned shelter building into a genuinely efficient, well-practiced collective skill rather than some constant, exhausting individual struggle against the elements. And honestly, the more you dig into the specific details behind all of this, the harder it becomes to view ancient humans as simply surviving, without houses in some grim, deprived sense. They weren't enduring a worse version of modern housing. They were running an entirely different system, one built around mobility, adaptability, and an intimate, generational understanding of their specific environment that most modern humans, frankly, have completely lost touch with. We've traded that flexible, deeply adaptive knowledge for drywall, insulation ratings, and central heating. And honestly, that trade clearly worked out pretty well for us in plenty of ways. But it's worth occasionally remembering that long before anyone ever needed a mortgage, a contractor, or a single power tool, humans had already figured out, through nothing but patient observation and generations of trial and error, exactly how to stay warm, dry, and safe almost anywhere on the entire planet, using little more than the landscape itself, fire, and the accumulated hard-won knowledge of everyone who'd faced that exact same cold night before them.